Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Kimmage, and I'm the chair of the Advisory Council at the Kennan Institute and a professor of history at Catholic University and the host of the Longview Conversations, which are deep dive, slower conversations about the former Soviet Union, sort of history, politics, and policy. And we are honored and delighted to have today Professor Sergey Radchenko here to speak about his new book. And I'll just introduce our speaker and then say a few words about the book itself. And then what we will do is have roughly half an hour of conversation about this remarkable book. And then the floor will be open to anybody who wishes to send in questions, and I'll urge people to do so on the Q&A function via Zoom, and I will be very happy to ask those questions in the second part of today's conversation. So Sergey Radchenko is the Wiliam E. Schmidt Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And I know that his career straddles the United Kingdom, the United States, and Italy, and many other countries as well. It's a source of pride that twice Professor Rodchenko has been a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center, and he's also has also been a global fellow at the Wilson Center. And so it's very nice to emphasize that connection. And let me, by way of introduction, also mention two books that Professor Rodchenko has published prior to the one that we'll be talking about today. And the first is The Two Suns in the Heavens, the Sino-Soviet Struggle for Supremacy, published in 2009. And then Unwanted Visionaries, the Soviet Failure in Asia in 2014. And if you detect a thread there of Soviet plus Asian history, I think that will take you to the current book, To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power, which is a remarkably comprehensive, meticulously researched, and beautifully written book that integrates the history of the United States, the history of China, and the history of the Soviet Union, all of which is perceived within a global purview, and works all of this into a very vivid narrative of the Cold War. And in addition to being, archival research that's very, very serious in nature. It's also a witty book and a book very alive to personality and to some of the ironies and paradoxes of the subject. So if our viewers have not yet read this book, it's my pleasure to give it, my warmest possible endorsement. But let me go now directly to the book itself. And Sergey, I wanted to start with a question that's maybe a little bit personal in nature. And I don't know when you began the work on this book. I would imagine it's quite a while ago because a book like this doesn't get written overnight. But I would presume that you finished the book after the February 24th invasion of Ukraine. And it's hard to imagine that an event of this magnitude wouldn't perhaps shape or color in some ways your view of the historical record. And so I wanted to begin there, if there were any events, and maybe the war itself is not the crucial one, but sort of any events in the recent past that encourage you to think differently about the history of the Cold War.
So, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, for the generous introduction. It is always great to do things with the Wilson Center. As you mentioned, I've spent many wonderful months as a visiting fellow there. It's a great place. And it's a special pleasure to talk about this book, which you showed already to our viewers. It is a big book. It took something like 10 years to write. 10 years. I started in 2014 and finished, well, it was published this year, so it took 10 years or maybe slightly more. And I mean, obviously, what you said, Michael, is absolutely true. Historians in general, I think, tend to filter historical events through the eyes of the epoch that they're living through. And we're maybe not supposed to do that. And I say that with full recognition that perhaps it is not necessarily best historians' practice to do that, but in many ways it's inevitable. I think my personal experiences from my background, my life in the decrepit USSR, in the Far East in Sakhalin Island, then eventually my experience in modern Russia as it reformed in the 1990s, and then my experience with Putinism and what that has done to Russia and to Russia's neighbors. And all of those events tend to influence one's interpretation. And here's how it influenced mine. When the Cold War ended, historians were looking at the experience of the Cold War and saying, well, that was something quite remarkable, probably not to be ever repeated. Communism was defeated. We were living in a beautiful new era when things were supposed to be different. And yet, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, it began to look as if things were returning to confrontation. Just as I was beginning to work on this book, we had instances of Russian imperialism already visible in the Russian wars in Georgia, later, obviously, the situation in Ukraine, annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so all of those things tend to impact your thinking, and you tend to see continuities. And so I began to see continuities between the post-Cold War and the Cold War. And indeed, the book is largely about continuities. It does not see the Cold War as an absolutely exceptional experience. It sees Soviet foreign policy as being motivated by factors that are deeply rooted in Russia's imperial past and that continue to the present in a way that we were perhaps not fully aware of when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And the key issue that I emphasize here is the Kremlin's striving for greatness. Now, that is a very general term. What is greatness? What is striving? And I go into some detail in the book about how I define some of those issues, in particularly this issue of recognition. The Soviets wanted to be recognized as a superpower because this is what made them feel legitimate. They felt they had a claim to greatness as a superpower, but they needed to be recognized externally. They craved for American recognition. And so much in Soviet foreign policy is explained by this sense of craving for recognition. I talk about this in the book and with various examples. But it's not just American recognition that the Soviets desired. They also wanted recognition by what you would call today, well, at that time it was called the global revolutionary forces. You might call it today the global South, the third world. And it was recognizing the recognition that they wanted was recognition as the leader of the revolutionary world. And there's two types of recognition. Being recognized by America as a great power, a superpower, sometimes conflicted with the ambition and the desire to be recognized by the global revolutionary forces as the global revolutionary power, leader of the global revolutionary forces. But the Soviets never recognized this contradiction. And that contradiction actually underpinned and sometimes derailed their foreign policy. And, we can talk about the specific examples, but I'll leave it here. That's basically, in a nutshell, this is what the book is about.
It's such a helpful framing for our conversation, because I want to return to this point at the end of our conversation about recognition and apply it to policy choices and questions of the present moment, and maybe compare it to an ideological reading of the Cold War and where that might take us at the present moment, and why looking at recognition, I think, is a new angle of vision. And I want to ask about some of the policy implications of that. Your conclusion in rapid fire form, sort of takes us through some of the Putin years and, takes us up almost to the present. And that's where I'd like to return, but not before going through the thickets of Cold War history, which I know is
and that's the fun part for a Cold War historian.
The core concern of your book. And so I want to, alert readers who may not have read the book already, to some of its key insights in line with this notion of the Soviet Union as a power, that it's not that you deny its ideological ambitions, that's a prominent part of your narrative, but this search for recognition with certain psychological components, kind of political cultural components, What I want to ask you about is the very intriguing triangle that you develop in your argument, sort of among the Soviet Union, the United States, and China, because your book is not a binary back and forth between Moscow and Washington. As in line with your earlier scholarship, you bring China up almost to a country on par with the U.S. and the Soviet Union in the history of the Cold War. And I was wondering if you would mind mentioning maybe a few of the ways in which this Soviet struggle or aspiration to be recognized, ran through the U.S. on the one hand, but also ran through China on the other. And I think affects the periodization of your book, the kind of China moment, and then there's a U.S. moment, and then it sort of inches back toward the China case toward the end. But if you could flesh out for our listeners the triangle that's really the centerpiece of your book.
So there are two pieces to this, and thank you for the questions. China is crucial to the book. I mean, the first thing that I have to mention is that in my previous work I focused on China quite a lot, so it's reasonable that I would bring China into general discussion of let's say the Cold War and Soviet-American relations. By the way, if you look at previous studies of the Cold War, you'll see that questions like Germany, questions like, let's say, the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, I mean, they have a place of prominence. China is not necessarily central to this kind of discussion. I think partly it has to do with historians. No historian can do everything, right? And we have had historians' role in the Cold War, and that is very important. We have had people who've worked, for example, on the arms race. We have had folks who've worked in Africa, for example. I have come to the subject with an interest in China. So in a sense, I leveraged that. I brought China into the book in a much more prominent way. And what I really had to do in the book about the Cold War is to learn about other subjects. So for me, China was easy. Other subjects like Germany, like Cold War in Europe, etc., was something that I really had to dig into, and that was actually quite difficult. Here's another thing, though. The second point that I wanted to make about China. For some time, we have had a kind of a decentralization of the Cold War, and I think it's a good thing that we've had it. So we've looked at the Cold War from the perspective of some of the smaller players or medium players. I have participated actively in this process. If you look at some of my previous scholarship, I've worked, for example, on such seemingly obscure subjects as Mongolia in the Cold War, or North Korea in the Cold War, or how Cold War impacted places like Burma, or I don't know, Angola, and so on and so forth. Why was that important? It was important to bring those stories into our general narrative so that the Cold War does not seem like just a story about Soviet-American confrontation. That there are other things, and indeed, many victims of the Cold War actually were the victims who were living in places that we today would call the global South. But in the end, as I was writing this book, I realized that although those players had their role to play in the Cold War, the general trend, nevertheless, was still set in places like Moscow, Washington, and Beijing in the third place. And Beijing played a huge role, of course, in the Cold War in Asia, in Korea, and later in Vietnam. It's very, very important. So that's another reason for bringing China into the narrative. But I'll give you a couple of examples, maybe, about how bringing China into our understanding of the Cold War changes this understanding. One example would have to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, everybody knows something about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in my book, I look at this story on the basis of all this new Soviet materials, also Chinese materials, and basically say that China played a very, very important role in this whole confrontation. How? What role? I argue that China and the Soviet conflict with China in the early 1960s directly played into Soviet decision to send missiles to Cuba. This is one of the arguments of the book. And Khrushchev was absolutely obsessed by China. And what he worried about in 1962, as he faced this prospect of a nuclear war with the United States, and as he came under pressure from the Kennedy administration to pull out, what he worried about was what impact that decision would have on the Soviet image and how the Soviet Union was seen as a global revolutionary power. And this is where he worried about China. He said, the Chinese will say that we sold out. The Chinese will say that we have betrayed the revolution. And if you look at what Khrushchev was talking about, what he wrote in his various letters and rants that he made, many of them are now documented in the Russian archives. Khrushchev talked about China again and again and again. I mean, he wrote like 30-page letters to Castro in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, trying to explain himself. And if you read them, you'll see that those letters are all about China. Then why is China not in our discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis? It has to be because it was there. Anyway, so that's one example. Another example that also is counterintuitive is 1969. We have the beginning of the process of Detente. Brezhnev turns, I mean, really, Detente really started in Europe, of course. Brezhnev turned first to the French and met forged a good relationship with de Gaulle, but then to Willy Brandt and reciprocating his Ostpolitik. And then, of course, we had a broader process of the Soviet American detente, notably with Richard Nixon's visit to Moscow in May 1972. But if we try to understand the reasons for detente, then one of the reasons is China. Because the Soviet relationship with China turned so incredibly nasty by the late 1960s that to Brezhnev, especially the social democrats in West Germany, in the past they would have been seen as the bad guys. The social democrats, as a communist, you don't touch them. But now, as against the Chinese, with their radicalism and Maoism and all of that, and the border conflict that they developed in March 1969, even the social democrats looked okay. So Brezhnev turned to the Europeans, to Western Europe, ultimately to the United States, and China, of course, played a huge role in all of that. So those are just two examples of how China played into this narrative. Just to finish on the subject of China, or maybe we'll touch on it again, but on the question of China, and Michael, you mentioned that in the book I talk about psychology of leadership. My slightly amateur psychological analysis focuses on the Soviet leaders because I just had the vast majority of materials is from the Russian archives. But I also had I was fortunate enough to access high-level Chinese materials in the course of my research, and what I discovered there is how the Chinese leaders were thinking. People like Mao Zedong, people like Deng Xiaoping, people like Zhou Enlai, on what basis they made their decision. And it's not surprising, but those also were deeply psychological. So Mao worried about his standing, how he would be recognized, who would recognize him, how his prestige as a global revolutionary leader. And of course, he clashed on this basis with Khrushchev, which is really a fascinating story, which I discuss in the book at great length.
Wonderful. So I'm also delighted to see questions coming into the Q&A, and let me just urge our viewership to keep them coming if you like. And in 12, 13, 14 minutes, we'll switch over to the audience's questions, but there's still a great deal I'd like to ask you about with this book. I want to jump forward to the figure of Gorbachev because I'll just say personally, you kind of changed my understanding of Gorbachev, who's a figure that I think we all read a lot about, and there are lots of received arguments and conventional arguments about Gorbachev in the end of the Cold War. And to me, I feel like you've reframed the progression from 1985 to 1991, and I'll just briefly paraphrase correctly, I hope, what you say, and then I want to ask you about the Gorbachev piece of the puzzle. But you characterize Gorbachev's efforts at reform as actually the unspectacular part of Gorbachev, that he's kind of an Andropovite, and he takes ideas that had been floating around the higher levels of Soviet government, and kind of collates them and maybe packages them as perestroika and glasnost, but that this, in a sense, was not the economic reforms in and of themselves were not the remarkable thing about Gorbachev. What was remarkable is that he makes a bid for recognition on a new set of premises. So Stalin had his way of getting recognized, through the Second World War and the awesomeness of the communist experiment at that time. sort of Khrushchev had his manner of getting recognized that ran initially through China and then through the so-called Third World. And Brezhnev had his tools of recognition, but Gorbachev really seeks out a new form of recognition, a kind of global humanism, anti-nuclear in some ways. It intersects with Reagan's worldview up to a point, but is also different. This kind of common European home from Lisbon to Vladivostok, the almost utopian idealistic element of Gorbachev. And I think we're familiar with that idealistic element of Gorbachev, but not as a geopolitical bid for recognition. So, first of all, I want to ask you if the paraphrase is correct, but then secondly, if you could just, sort of run a little bit further with it and how you fit Gorbachev into this book. It was, to me, just entirely eye-opening.
So thank you, Michael. It's a very accurate summary, and I'm also glad that you immediately picked up on this because I was, in fact, I'm still worried about my description of Gorbachev and how I cover Gorbachev because it is very unconventional. People reading it will be, I think some readers will be absolutely scandalized by the way that I treat Gorbachev in this book. Um, uh, for me, the big mystery of Gorbachev is this. Here's a guy who becomes the general secretary in March 1985. Um, he's the leader of a great superpower. Oh, it's got problems. We know that it has problems. He knew that it had problems. And yet, it seems that he could just be in this position and not worry about anything. He could have continued as a general secretary for 30 years at that point, and things would just be fine for him. And yet he begins this process of reform. Why? What is it that he wants to accomplish? And this is where those ambitions to be recognized, I think, come in and play an important role. To be recognized for what? To be recognized as somebody who breathed new life into the Soviet project because he understood that Soviet ideology, as it was being at that time peddled, sold to global audiences, was a hollow sound. And Gorbachev wasn't the first to understand that. Brezhnev understood that. He perfectly understood that. Brezhnev replaced Soviet ideology with what Vlad Zubok describes as kind of ideology of peace. He really was concerned about how to prevent nuclear war, how to build up a relationship with the United States that would preserve peace globally, and so on and so forth. And Brezhnev, rather Gorbachev, effectively takes over some of the same thinking. He inherits this thinking from Brezhnev about peace and about the Soviet Union's role in preserving peace. And of course, Brezhnev also was not new. Indeed, it was Nikita Khrushchev, even Malenkov, who first peddled the idea of peaceful coexistence, the idea that now with nuclear weapons, you simply cannot have wars between great powers. And if this is the case, then what is the problem? Let's try to solve this. Try to achieve some compromise for the benefit of peace in the world. And so Khrushchev was, of course, he had his own share of crisis, and Brezhnev really pushed this idea. And then Gorbachev comes in with similar ideas, which he terms new thinking. And in the book, I actually go into some detail and identify many of the propositions of Gorbachev's new thinking as, in fact, old thinking. So there's a continuity there with the past. And again, the book is about continuities. Of course, there are differences. Of course, Khrushchev conducted his foreign policy in one way, Brezhnev in a different way. Gorbachev launched a process of reforms that brought the Soviet Union to its knees. That's not what he wanted, but this is what happened, right? So there's something different about Gorbachev, maybe simply the fact that he could not control this process. But in other respects, Gorbachev also strove for recognition, just as Brezhnev did and Khrushchev did. And you already alluded to some of the points of his foreign policy agenda. That is that basically controlling nuclear weapons. This was a very important aspect for him. Especially after Chernobyl, he realized how dangerous nuclear weapons were. Pulling out from Afghanistan. Now, even Brezhnev recognized that Afghanistan was a terrible mistake. In fact, it happened almost right away after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So Gorbachev decided to do that, but it took a long time to to pull out from there, and that again was for reasons of not for the reasons of Soviet credibility. He didn't want to appear like he was abandoning a client in need. And this is a similar motivation that also underpinned American involvement in Vietnam, as we know. So there's a lot of similarity there. So all of that, and then yes, then I think in my final chapter I talk about the very final years of the Soviet Union and how Gorbachev was hoping to end the Cold War, but rescue from the ruins of the Cold War something like a global recognition of the Soviet role in ending the Cold War. He really wanted to do that, and you can see that in his meetings with, for example, George Bush Sr. In Malta. He would say things like, the Cold War lost. We did not lose. The Cold War lost. Did he actually think that, or was he just trying to make up a good story? From Bush's perspective, it was much more straightforward. Freedom won. America stands for freedom, therefore America won. He said that he did not want to dance on the Berlin Wall, but in many ways he kind of did dance actually on the Berlin Wall. Gorbachev was really upset by that. He felt that the Americans were pushing this whole idea that the West had won, that Western values had won, and he said, no, those are not Western. Those are our values. Those are universal values. Therefore, the values have won, but we have just done just as much as, if not more than the Americans in realizing those values. So anyway, in the end, of course, the Soviet Union fell apart, but that was mainly for economic reasons. And that, again, highlights the importance of economics and how you can have all the ambition in the world to be a great power. But if you don't have the fundamentals to make it work, it's just not going to work. And the Soviet Union did not have those fundamentals. It had a basically broken economic system. Soviet leaders recognized this already in the mid-1960s. They had a period of a miraculous economic growth in the 1950s, with some actually impressive results in science and technology, as we know. But then in the 1960s, it was already becoming clear that the whole communist project was going to hell. And they tried to reform it in the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s, with the Kosygin reforms and introduction of individual incentives. And then all of that basically died away until Gorbachev had to come back to that. Why is it that it died away? The story is well known. It's because they discovered oil and gas that they could export in large quantities, and that allowed the Soviet Union to live another day, basically survive for another decade or a little bit more, until finally Gorbachev came around and said, okay, now what are we going to do?
Well, that's sort of a wonderfully comprehensive answer to the question. It leads me to my final question, and there are really quite a number now from our audience, and it's a slightly long question, but let me pose it to you this way. So it's soon going to be the 50th anniversary of the Kennan Institute. I think in November of this year is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Kennan Institute. And the Kennan Institute exists for two purposes. One is to sponsor research as such, but the other is to translate the findings of that research to the extent that one can, if not into policy prescriptions, then into a refinement of the conversation about policy. So it's in the spirit of that I want to ask you this question. I think that your book, and we began the conversation by talking about the last couple of years, I think your book does not just cast Gorbachev in a new light. I think in a way it casts Putin in a new light. And of course, there are many Putins out there. And one of them is Putin the ideologue, with his civilizational schemes and his obsession with, sort of with history. There's Putin the imperialist, sort of the conservative nationalist. And you can analyze the war in Ukraine in those terms. And I don't think it's necessarily that different or a contradiction to say that you can also analyze it in terms of recognition. And that I mean in two respects, or I just want to run this by you, that there is what you describe in your conclusion, a kind of failure between the United States and Russia that transpires after 2003, perhaps with the Iraq War and worsening U.S.-Russian relationship, where recognition is just not going to work for Putin from the United States, as it often didn't work for Soviet leaders to get from the U.S., and that's something that Putin had tried to achieve in the beginning of his presidency, but it doesn't pan out for him. But there's another angle to the search for recognition, which is the global angle. And it is very intriguing to see how Putin's Russia has tried to couch the war, not just in regional terms and not just in national terms, settling scores, Russian national or imperial grievances, but there is this kind of global vocabulary that Putin uses, often very unpersuasive to people in the United States, sort of anti-colonial or what have you, but it's there. And so I want to understand from your vantage point what policy benefits there might be to bringing more of this search for recognition in. Where does it take us in the policy conversation? How could we perhaps articulate or elaborate better policy options if we better understand this aspect of the Russian-Soviet historical tradition, but also of the present moment?
Thank you, Michael. So that's a complicated question, as you say. Um, uh, Generally speaking, when we analyze Russian or Soviet foreign policy, historically, the way we've done it, and I'm oversimplifying here massively, but we've looked at issues like security considerations. Russia or the Soviet Union is deemed to have security concerns, whether legitimate or not. Obviously, they'll see them as legitimate. We do not necessarily see them as legitimate. And then we also have this other explanation for Soviet behavior, which is ideological. In other words, it's not that they have security concerns, but it's just in the Soviet times, they were just obsessed with the communist project. They wanted to spread it around the world. And of course, Vlad Zubokov and Konstantin Pleshakov famously wrote about that in the context of inside the Kremlin's Cold War in the 1990s, the revolutionary imperial paradigm was called at that time. And I think there's a lot to it. So in general, when you explain foreign policy, focusing on one particular explanation and saying this is it, and that explains everything, is probably a recipe for disaster. It's probably not a good starting point. So if we say even today that Putin has just security concerns, he's just worried about NATO enlargement into Russia's space, I think this would be fallacy. On the other hand, if we just say, well, actually, he doesn't have any security concerns. Actually, it's all about Russian imperialism. And by the way, here, imperialism, again, takes on ideological connotations and imperialism as an ideology. Then we also might be ignoring something else, i.e., that he may actually have security concerns. In other words, it's always a interplay of different factors. And sometimes, as I discovered in the course of my research on the Soviet phenomenon and Soviet foreign policy making, even the leaders themselves are sometimes incapable of distinguishing between different underlying motivations of their behavior. They think they're acting for one reason, maybe they're acting for another reason, or they're acting for a variety of reasons. So the way I try to do it in my introduction, which is actually quite risky, put it this way, I bring in the Maslow pyramid of human needs, which is based on a paper that Maslow wrote back in 1940s about how what people are motivated by. And by the way, Maslow's approach has been criticized because it is unduly, according to some psychologists, unduly hierarchical. In other words, it's not that you have to satisfy certain needs before other needs come into play. But I try to do that. I basically say, okay, there are security concerns and they can serve as a foundation. But then once basic security concerns are satisfied, other things are built onto this pyramid, and this includes ideological factors that could be used instrumentally by the Soviets, or maybe actually could be used as the primary motivation for their behavior. But also, as I claim, I can set all of this aside, and I can say fundamentally, what is it that they wanted to be? What is it that they wanted to be? They wanted to be seen as legitimate in their claim to greatness. And I don't know how you necessarily square this with this pyramid and the complexity of motivations. But what I do say in the book is you can see that in their foreign policy behavior, they wanted to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of different audiences. And I think if you use this model and apply it to today's Russia, you'll see a lot of parallels. So Putin also wants to be recognized. He wants to be recognized for his greatness. He wants to be recognized. He wanted to be, as I show in my conclusion to the book, he wanted to be recognized as American partner for a long time. And then it seems that it didn't really work out for him for a variety of reasons. Perhaps he was not getting the recognition he thought he deserved. And so he decided to seek legitimation through being recognized as America's key adversary. And that's kind of ironic because you can be, but if you think about it, it makes sense. You can be recognized, you can be legitimized by recognition as either a partner. This is what Brezhnev tried to do with Nixon, create a great condominium between two great powers, or you can be recognized as the great other, the great adversary. And that too gives you legitimacy in your own eyes and in the eyes of the world. So Putin, and then in this sense, tries to kind of augment Russia's standing in the world. And then he also wants to be recognized as the great leader of the anti-Western forces. And this is where this other aspect comes in with his appeal to the global South, with his calls for the multipolar world, with his effort to rally countries like India and Brazil and China, of course. He's trying to say, look, I am leading the struggle against the decadent West. I'm the leader of the struggle. And although Russia is pushing much above its weight, but it still has the aspiration. So if you look at that part of it, of Putin's motivations, then I think there's a parallel here to the Soviet to be recognized as the leader of the revolutionary forces during the Cold War. And this is another kind of continuity. So they wanted to be recognized as the leader of the revolutionary forces. Their main recognizers were in the global South. Their main recognizers were China. They were, the jungle revolutionaries. They were Cuba, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, there's this continuity. Now, what does it make? Does it make any difference for policy? I don't know, Michael. I mean, that's why I write history books and not policy books, right? Because if I then try to convert that into some advice for policy, I won't know what to say. I won't know what to say. But since you began by mentioning Kennan, I should perhaps end my remarks also by returning to Kennan. And I should say that if you go back to the long telegram that Kennan wrote in 1946 at the outset of the Cold War, a lot of people always quote the long telegram in different parts of it because it was so long, obviously. But at the end of the telegram, he has this very interesting set of policy prescriptions. He says, how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this, the very Soviet insecurities, their aggressiveness, et cetera, et cetera. What he basically says is we should invest in our own resilience and we should build up our own societies and not worry about those people. They'll sort themselves out, basically, is what he says. I'm paraphrasing badly, right? Do not quote me on the long telegram. But if you go to the end of the long telegram, you'll see where I'm talking about. He's talking about they're investing in our own resilience. And that, I think, this is an insight that still applies today to the way we deal with Russia, to the way we deal with China, because we do, we know that those countries are want to be recognized as the greats of the world. They are doing all kinds of things to undermine the West. We know that they're actively scheming to do that. Sometimes we overreact, I think, to some of those things, and I sometimes we tend to give them more credit than is due to them, because in the end, certainly, as is with this is the case with Russia and the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. The Soviets and the Russians, they've always had they've had a much greater ambition than they ever had the means, and that is their curse. And also, this is something that you could it's perhaps also sees the blessing for them, because they've always been able to blow themselves much bigger than they actually are. They've always had this ambition to be out there, running the world. And I think by recognizing this ambition of theirs, we're helping them.
I think that there's an enormous amount there for policymakers to take into account. And I would just underscore something that you said at the beginning of the conversation. To look at 1991 as a categorical end to something after which everything is somehow new is, I think, a grave mistake. And so for policymakers seeking to understand, in a sense, the presence of these continuities, I think analytically is just a very helpful thing. And this oscillation, the Soviet Union's oscillation between the United States and China was in fact Putin's oscillation. And so there is a sense in which it's part of a broader historical pattern, and that I think even if it doesn't, yield very discrete policy choices, is of great use and value to policymakers just for their understanding of the present moment. But I'm going to turn, Sergey, now to questions from our audience. And the first one takes us back even before the Second World War. And this is from an anonymous attendee of our conversation who asks about the Soviet struggle to be recognized, which appears to have begun with Lenin and Wilson. How about the role of the other superpower in the early to mid 1990s, 1900s, that is the British Empire? So, as if your book is not global enough, let's bring the British Empire into the picture.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a valid question. I think it really highlights one of the arguments of the book, that is that the Cold War was not, I mean, in some ways, the Cold War was unique, and I can explain how it was unique. But in other ways, it really was a continuation of some of the longer term trends that were already developing in the Soviet Union, in Russia under the Tsars. And that is why so many of the Soviet motivations, the striving for greatness, etc., they are rooted deeply in imperial history, as I mentioned already. And here, Great Britain does play a role because, of course, Great Britain was the great other for Russia in the 19th century. Here comes in the Great Game and their struggle for power influence in Central Asia and various other places. Imperial pursuits at that time for the Soviet Union, or rather for Imperial Russia in the 19th century, were just as much, if not more, about external, and in that case, European recognition of Russia as a truly great power than they were about, let's say, the commercial aspect of empire or the security aspect of empire. So the striving for recognition certainly preceded Soviet leaders, but they really came to it in a sharp kind of way in 1944-45. That is because the Second World War, the way it was won, the way it left the Soviet Union as a preponderant military power in Europe, seemed to dictate a new set of ambitions for them. And I start in the first couple of chapters of the book, I discuss those things, right? I discuss the post-war planning by Soviet leaders. I assess the extent of their ambitions, both in Europe and extra European ambitions, for example, striving for colonies in Africa and so on and so forth. So a lot of continuity there, yes, with the 19th century.
Wonderful. Let me move to another question, which takes us not to the United Kingdom, but to China. This question from Gilbert Rossman, who asks whether China in the 1990s and thereafter, whether it understood the Moscow's need for recognition, or perhaps understood that need better than the West did. So this is, I guess, a post-1991 question about China and Russia, and sort of China's use of this Russian appetite for recognition for its purposes.
So that's a great question, Gil, and thank you for joining this conversation. I talk about this in the, I think, conclusion to the book, where I refer to the comment made by Foreign Minister Kozyrev, who was Yeltsin's first foreign minister, where he said, we need to have a close relationship. And I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact quote, but he basically said, we need to have a close relationship with the West, especially with the United States, because it is only by having a partnership with the United States that we can have our ambitions as a great power duly satisfied. And so in the early 1990s, we had that reorientation of Russian foreign policy towards the West. And Yeltsin was desperate for a condominium of the kind that Brezhnev had or aspired to have in his time with Nixon, even though post-Soviet Russia was only just a mere shadow of what the USSR had been. But the ambition remained. And Yeltsin hoped for Bill Clinton to recognize this. He wanted this recognition. It's very clear. It's very clear in his various comments and how he thought that Russia should be a major partner for the United States and how it should even be admitted to NATO before anybody else, before all of those little tidy, small bit players in Eastern Europe who aspired to NATO. And this was Yeltsin's vision. The Chinese never bought it. So they had, obviously, in the early 1990s, there was a falling out between China and the United States, China and the West, that took some time to repair as a result, obviously, of the events of 1989. Then this relationship started to turn more positive. The relationship between China and the West, but still, when Chinese leaders traveled to Moscow, which again became possible because Yeltsin recognized that actually China was a very important partner for Russia. Briefly, he kind of even thought that, the Chinese are communists, let's not even deal with them at all. But this was a very, very short moment. Then later, already by 1993, he basically changed his outlook. And so the Chinese were traveling to Moscow. And interestingly, I got records of some of their discussions in Moscow, which are really interesting. This goes to the state of the Russian archives and what you can and what you cannot get. So I got stuff up to 2000. And in some of those conversations, I'm trying to remember who it was. It was either Jiang Zemin or maybe somebody like that in the conversation with Russian leaders were saying, you should not, you will wake up from this and you will recognize that we're right and you should kind of keep a distance from the West, etc. So it's actually there. The Chinese are basically telling the Russians, have to be, you have to recognize where your interests are, so to speak. Although this is not in the book, that must be, I have to put it in the next book at some point. But anyway, so that yes, the Chinese had their very different view, I think. Also, the Iranians had no, it wasn't the Iranians, the Iraqis at that time. The Iraqis were sending delegations to Moscow, and I'm here talking about sort of 97, 98, and they were also telling the Russians, why are you just why are you so close to the United States? You have to understand this is not in your interest, and so on. So you can see some echoes there that continue to sound even today.
So one note in the chat that the first question from the anonymous participant, the person was unwillingly anonymous. That was Ivan Kurila, another historian who's
Ivan, thank you for joining that. Really, really great to have you here.
Another historian in our conversation. Let me move now to another question, which is a little bit maybe more philosophical in nature. This from Benji Cynic. I hope that I'm pronouncing the name correctly. And this is the question about why there was the need or the appetite for recognition among Soviet leaders in the first place. If I recall in the book, there's a certain pairing of, and I think that this came through in your opening comments of the appetite for recognition is connected to a desire for legitimacy, that these are twinned or paired elements of Soviet political culture. But where did this desire for recognition come from? Why was not every country has it. Not every leadership cadre has this desire for recognition, especially on the global level. And so, what are the prior circumstances that pushed the Soviet leaders to wish for recognition?
So that's a great question. It's a philosophical question as well. I think fundamentally, people make foreign policy and people have a desire for recognition, and that's just true of everybody. I think the Russians are not exceptional. I already mentioned the Chinese here, but I think the Americans have just as much a desire for recognition as anybody else. But this recognition can be obtained, and legitimacy that comes from recognition can be obtained from different sources. So, for example, in the United States, there's a democratic process, one hopes, and that gives the United States political establishment a sense of legitimacy because it comes from the people. It doesn't mean that the United States does not need external recognition. Of course, it does. In fact, being recognized as the leader of the free world by various authoritarian regimes like Russia or China is what adds to American leadership and adds to American legitimacy. Isn't that so? I mean, that is kind of makes sense. But I think in the Soviet case, this craving for recognition was particularly acute for two reasons. First of all, that the sources of domestic legitimacy dried up fairly quickly, i.e., communism was not delivering. Khrushchev had promised to build communism by 1980. Instead, as the joke goes, they decided to hold the Olympics, but it just wasn't working, right? It wasn't working, and so if the system was not working, then somehow it had to be legitimated externally. That is the first reason, and the second reason why it made so much, why it played such a big role in the Soviet case, is that somehow the Soviets felt inferior. They always felt inferior to the West, and it's not just a Soviet thing. I mean, this Kennan talks about that in the Long Telegram. I think he describes this as a traditional Russian sense of inferiority, and I think it does exist. The sense that somehow the West looks down on them, and therefore they have to show, as Khrushchev would say, we'll show you Kuzka's mother because you're unjust to us in the sense that you look down on us. So that I think added to the Soviet craving. I apologize about the reference to Kuzka's mothers, but I think everybody who visits the Kennan Center knows about Kuzka's mothers.
We'll go
The
from a
Kennan.
philosophical question to a very precise question, and I think there may be time for one further question after that. Although there are many wonderful questions in the chat. This is a very specific one. This is from Bill Courtney, and he's asking about JFK in 1961 and JFK's weak performance at the Vienna summit with Khrushchev, and whether this led Khrushchev to build the Berlin Wall or played a role in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. So this is we've gone from the big macro picture to something very precise.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think it's first of all, it's a good question. I don't agree that Kennedy necessarily performed badly in Vienna. There is this general sense in the historiography and accepted historiography that he didn't do as well as he could have, and then Khrushchev decided that he could intimidate him because he was young and inexperienced and so on. I didn't see that in the documents. Here's what I saw in the documents. In 1961, the German problem becomes absolutely intolerable to Khrushchev. That's mainly for economic reasons because people are voting with their feet. Socialist paradise built by Comrade Ulbricht is so great that nobody wanted to live there. So they're basically they're taking their talents, their youth with them. They're going over to the other side, and that gaping hole is what is seriously undermining the situation, makes it very, very deeply unstable. So Khrushchev, already recognizing this in 1958, launches his so-called Berlin Ultimatum. That doesn't go anywhere. Then Kennedy comes into office, and Khrushchev initially hopes that Kennedy is going to help him solve this problem. That's why when he came into office, and that was of course after Khrushchev's relation with Eisenhower had soured significantly. But with Kennedy comes into office, Khrushchev releases some American airmen who had been detained as a gesture of goodwill, and it seems like they are having a fairly productive relationship early on, but it sours very quickly, and it sours already with the Bay of Pigs. Khrushchev sees that as deeply aggressive, and how can Kennedy do that, and so on. And so then we get to the June summit, and they have this a series of very tense discussions there. I had both the Russian and the American versions of those discussions. They're actually quite similar, including that comment about Kennedy's comment about that this is going to be a cold winter. Is that in the Russian? I can't now exactly remember. But anyway, so Kennedy finishes this meeting with Khrushchev by saying, this is going to be a very cold winter. What happens then is that the problem intensifies for Khrushchev. He's trying to figure out, should he bring it to boil? In other words, should he just basically say, we're going to sign a separate treaty or sign a separate treaty with the GDR, with the consequence that then the GDR imposes controls on a movement between East Berlin and West Berlin, that could actually lead to war. And so in the Presidium discussions, they're talking about that. So Khrushchev says, what is the possibility that we'll have a nuclear war over Berlin? And Khrushchev says something like, this possibility is 5%. In other words, why would the Americans go to war over Berlin? Who would care? Why? It doesn't make any sense. But then when push comes to shove, he decides that he can simply not tolerate bringing the crisis to boil, and he decides instead to build the Berlin Wall, which is a way to diffuse the crisis, right? The building of the wall in August 1961 is to diffuse the crisis. It's not to intensify the crisis. And I discuss in the book actually in great detail about why he does that, despite thinking that the chances of war with the United States is only 5%. And there are a couple of reasons that I mentioned. First, I mentioned the fact that Khrushchev, of course, experienced the Second World War, and he knew what war was like. His son died in the Second World War. He was at Stalingrad. He saw the horrible destruction of war. The atomic revolution, of course, made it all the more horrible. And then there's this other interesting anecdote. In the run-up to the Berlin crisis, rather the construction of the Berlin Wall, he constantly talks about this business of the wall. And at one point, he suddenly recounts a story from the Second World War. At that time, the Germans had already invaded the USSR. The USSR was not doing very well. They were retreating. And there was a guy who was in charge of one of the Russian armies called Nikolai Vashugin, who basically lost an army and came to Khrushchev. He was in Kiev and said, I've lost an army. What should I do? And then he pulled out a gun, a handgun, Vashugin did, and blew his brains out right in front of Khrushchev. And, obviously it's a dramatic story, but what struck me is why Khrushchev would tell the story in the context of the Berlin crisis, as in talking about Berlin. And it becomes abundantly clear. He basically thinks that Kennedy, he may be a reasonable guy, but who knows how he would act under pressure. So, and this is where Khrushchev's doubts about the American system come into play. He thought actually that Kennedy was being manipulated by Rockefeller and the military-industrial complex and so on and so forth. So he says, man, Kennedy may be a good guy, but what if the military-industrial complex basically forces him to start a nuclear war? How can we actually say? So in the end, there's this radical uncertainty that he faces. Should he do something if should he take this gamble if the chances are even 5%, but who knows, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 50, who can tell that a war will break out, a nuclear war? He simply was not willing to take this risk, and that is why he backed down. That's why he decided to build the Berlin Wall.
So we've come to the last question of our conversation, and this from Stein Tennyson. And it takes us in the direction of the global south, which I think, given the content of your book, is a good place to end up. And the question is about Soviet Chinese support for North Vietnam, and what kind of recognition this brought either to the USSR or to China. And obviously, this was a period of enormous crisis for the US, where a lot of people in the US and outside of the US were asking questions about American power, but that that line of inquiry is very prominent in the U.S. I think we're far less aware of the bid for recognition in light of Vietnam and how that worked for the Soviet Union. So that's the final question for you, Sergey.
So thank you, Stein, and I do apologize for being so long-winded, like the book itself, of course, and in trying to answer those questions. I know there's some unanswered questions, and those people who did not have their questions answered, just feel free to email me, and I'll try to answer in just in regular time. But with regard to Vietnam, so yes, there's a whole chapter on the Vietnam War in the book. And my take on the Vietnam War is radically different from I think most accounts of the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War is usually written about from the perspective of the United States. And we're talking about here American war in Vietnam, not the earlier French misadventure there. Sometimes you have books, like, for example, Nguyen Han Lien has written about, Vietnam War reasonably from the Vietnamese perspective. In my book, I talk about the Soviet take on this war. And I continue here in the tradition of Ilya Gaiduk, late Ilya Gaiduk, who has written a book about this. But what I bring into this discussion is, first of all, I was very fortunate with sources. So somehow in the course of my research, I was able to get my hands on every single top-level conversation between the Soviet leaders and the Vietnamese leaders. So people like Lizoa, Van Dong, all of them coming to Moscow, talking about where they are with their war. So it allowed me particularly, an additional depth there and try to analyze what the Soviets were trying to get out of Vietnam and how they really were, what their policy was. And the key argument that I make there is that, again, China was very important for them. China was hugely important. Vietnam was not super important for Khrushchev. When Khrushchev was the first secretary, he thought Cuba was very important. He really liked Castro. He wanted to be recognized by Castro. He wanted to help Castro, but he didn't really care about Vietnam. Somehow Vietnam did not really enter his calculations. But when the new Soviet leaders came into power, and we're talking about October 1964, we're talking about Brezhnev and Kosygin, these people really turned towards Vietnam for two reasons. First, there's escalation in Vietnam. The Americans, that's, of course, after Tonkin Gulf, the Americans become increasingly involved. And for the new Soviet leaders, who did not have legitimacy. We're coming back to legitimacy. They did not have legitimacy. They were trying to establish their legitimacy. How do you establish a legitimacy? Well, you basically help a revolutionary cause, and for them, Vietnam became that cause. They decided to help Vietnam in a major way, and then China comes in. And of course, that is at the time when the Soviets and the Chinese are having this worst quarrel. And for the Soviets, it's so important to prove to the entire revolutionary world that they are the ones helping Vietnam, that they are the ones that without their help, Vietnam would basically collapse. And so there's a big quarrel there. And much of Soviet involvement in Vietnam is impossible to understand without taking China into the equation. Of course, ultimately, the Soviets won in Vietnam in the sense that the Chinese were outplayed. But that's also partly for the reasons, the Chinese had themselves to blame with the Cultural Revolution and their radical policies. But in the end, the Soviets had the equipment. They also had the patience. Brezhnev was so frequently frustrated by the Vietnamese leaders. He thought that the North Vietnamese were just intractable, stubborn. They were not open to negotiations with Americans, which is what Brezhnev wanted them to do. But in the end, he simply could not force them. He simply could not force them because for him, supporting this client, this revolutionary client in need, was a big part of what it meant to be the leader of the revolutionary cause.
Well, that seems a perfect summation in a microcosm of the argument that you make in To Run the World. Let me show the book once more on the screen. To Run the World by Sergey Radchenko. And, I think there are just so many ways in which this book brings fresh understandings to the Cold War and, deepens our understanding of that whole period from 1945 to the 1990s and beyond. So great thanks to you, Sergey, for writing the book. Thank you also for joining us today for this conversation. And I look forward to more to come when your next book comes out. We'll, sort of see when that is, but I suspect it will not be that far from now. So we'll follow up in that regard. But thank you to everybody in our audience for joining. For those who wish to see more information about the Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center, please go to the website. Please be aware of the Kennan X and Russia File podcasts, and there's a lot of up-to-the-minute analysis on the Russia File and Focus Ukraine blogs, and of course there'll be information to come about future Longview conversations. But more than anything, I would like to ask my virtual audience to join me in thanking Sergey for taking the time to be with us today, and of course for writing this book. So, Sergey, thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center for a fantastic conversation.